Hi, this is Lisa. In this video, we're going to talk about perfect square trinomials. But before we get there, we're going to review multiplying square binomials. So a square binomial means we have the square of a binomial or a polynomial with two terms, x, in this case, x and y. To multiply out, you have to write that binomial down twice. X plus y times x plus y. And when we distribute or FOIL, we get x squared plus xy, y times x or plus xy, and y times y is y squared. Notice you have two of those middle terms. So x squared plus 2xy plus y squared. The other form of binomial that we have is x minus y squared. Again, the square part tells us we have to write it down twice. X minus y times x minus y. It's the same thing written down two times. X times x is x squared. X times minus y gives us minus xy. Negative y times x or minus xy. And minus y times minus y gives us plus y squared. Again, we have exactly two of those middle terms. This time they're both negative, so x squared minus 2xy plus y squared. So the only difference between these two binomials is that the middle term, when you have a sum, when you're multiplying, you get a positive middle term. When you have a difference when you're multiplying, you get a negative middle term. But it's the first term squared and the last term squared with two of the first times the last. And we're going to use that when we look at polynomials to factor. We're going to look at that standard form. So the result of multiplying a square binomial is called a perfect square trinomial. So x squared plus 2xy plus y squared is a perfect square trinomial, and x squared minus 2xy plus y squared is a perfect square trinomial. We're going to talk about factoring those. So the first step is to determine whether you have a perfect square trinomial. And I've written example number 1 up here. We're going to kind of use that and follow through as I go through the steps. Determine whether you have a perfect square trinomial. If the sign of the last term is positive, it is. I have a positive 25. We might be on the right track. If the first and last terms are perfect squares, we may have a perfect square trinomial. Well, in this example, x squared and 25 are both perfect squares because 25 can be written as 5 squared. If you may have a perfect square trinomial, begin by factoring the first and last terms. Okay, so I'm going to copy this down. I had x squared plus 10x plus 25. So the first and the last terms. My first term is x squared, so it factors as x and x. My last term is a positive 25. It factors as 25 times, sorry, not 25. 25 factors as 5 times 5. Then to determine whether to add or subtract the middle terms, you look at the middle. If the middle term is negative, then you're going to do subtraction signs. If the middle term is positive, then we're going to add. Our middle term is positive, so it tells us that this is the form we want. We want to add our terms. To see if this is correct, you multiply the inside and the outside terms. These products should yield the middle term in the trinomial. So again, my trinomial was x squared plus 10x plus 25, and I'm going to check to see, is x plus 5 times x plus 5, does that give me the correct polynomial? And it says check by multiplying the inside and the outside terms. So inside terms, 5 times x is 5x, and it's positive, and x times 5 is positive 5x. 5x plus 5x gives me 10x. That does give me the correct middle term for my polynomial. And then you can write it as a perfect square binomial. So in this case, our factors were x plus 5, and we had 2 of them, so we can write it as x plus 5 squared. Let me do a couple more examples for you. Example number 2. So our first step is to see if it is a perfect square trinomial. So if we're on the right track, I should be able to write the first term as something squared, and that works. I should be able to write the last term as something squared, and I can. And I check to make sure that last term is a positive. Then to begin the factoring, we're going to say we have the first and the last, the first and the last. We look at the middle term to determine what the sign should be in our factors, negative, negative. And then we multiply out the inside and the outside terms to see if we have the correct middle term. Negative 3 times x is negative 3x. X times negative 3 is negative 3x. Negative 3x minus 3x is negative 6x. That does give me the correct middle term. So I know my correct factoring now. I go back and I write this as x minus 3 squared. There's my perfect square binomial. One last example. I'm going to follow the same steps again. Positive last term. First term can be written as something squared. 36x squared is the same as 6x quantity squared. 49y squared is 7y quantity squared. I do my 2 sets of parentheses with the first term and the last term. First term and the last term. And I look at my middle term to see what the sign should be. I should have 2 negatives. And then I multiply out the inside. Negative 7y times 6y. Negative 7 times 6 is negative 42. I have an x and a y. I do the same thing with the last. 6 times negative 7 is negative 42. I have an x and a y. And when I combine those, negative 42 and negative 42xy are negative 84xy. And when I look at my binomial, that was the middle term that I had there. So now I can write my product as the square binomial. 6x minus 7y quantity squared. And that concludes the video on factoring a perfect square trinomial.